It was treachery at first, to turn against brothers, to kill for personal advancement and power. But we have seen them, how their minds and bodies have been corrupted. Their very belief systems have been warped. This is no longer Horus's treachery, it is his heresy.
The Horus Heresy, sometimes referred to poetically as the Age of Darkness and originally known in its immediate aftermath as the Great Heresy War, was a galaxy-spanning civil war that consumed the worlds of mankind for 9 Terran years. Its outbreak marked the end of the Emperor of Mankind's Great Crusade to reunite the scattered colony worlds of humanity in the Milky Way galaxy under a single government and the beginning of the current age of the Imperium. The Horus Heresy is in many ways the founding event of the Imperium of Man as it now exists. The civil war began following the corruption by the ruinous powers of chaos of the Imperial Warmaster Horus Lupercal, the Primarch of the Sons of Horus Legion and the most beloved genetic son of the Emperor. The Chaos Gods fed Horus' innate ambition and sense of betrayal by the Emperor until he turned upon his father and sought to claim the Imperium for his own. Horus convinced half of the other Primarchs and Space Marine legions, as well as large swaths of the Imperial army and the forces of the ancient Mechanicum, to turn traitor alongside him and unleash a cataclysmic attempt to conquer the galaxy in his name. Over 9 Terran years the war raged, 7 of them consumed by Horus' drive on the throne world, until coming to a final cataclysm on Terra itself, where Horus was slain and the Emperor mortally wounded, his dreams of creating a brighter future for mankind forever broken. The conflict was fought across the Milky Way galaxy early in the 1st century of the 31st millennium and resulted in more than 2.3 trillion dead, 4.6 trillion if one includes the planetary populations purged by the Imperium after the heresy due to the taint of chaos corruption. The heresy concluded with the death of the traitorous Warmaster Horus, the internment of the Emperor in the Golden Throne, and the exile into the Eye of Terror of the heretic Astartes traitor legions. The heresy was directly responsible for the birth of the present-day structure of the Space Marine chapters following the Second Founding and the reorganization of the Imperium by the Ultramarines Primarch Robert Guilliman as Lord Commander of the Imperium and Imperial Regent during the time of rebirth in the 31st millennium. While the below account is highly detailed, it should be noted that much of this information would be completely unknown to the average inhabitant of the Imperium of Man in the 41st millennium. The Horus Heresy occurred over 10,000 Terran years ago, a nearly unimaginable span of time. As a result, it has become nothing more than a collection of often distorted or misunderstood legends and mythology to the average imperial citizen. When the effects of the deification of the Emperor, the theological needs of the Adeptus Ministorum, and the outright deletions and fabrications of imperial history carried out by the Inquisition are added into the equation, the truth of the events surrounding the Horus Heresy could prove very shocking indeed to the people of the Imperium. Over 28,000 standard years before the start of the Horus Heresy, during the Age of Terror, mankind first left the polluted, used-up carcass of old Earth for the unknown bounties and perils beyond the skies of our birth world. In those forgotten early years, it is unknown what enemies and trials humanity overcame in our uncaring universe to not only survive, but thrive and forge a domain amongst the stars. Colonies spread across our galaxy so that humanity was scattered across 1,000,000 worlds and found treasures and horrors uncounted. Mankind's technological mastery ascended to an almost unimaginable zenith, and at its heart lay a resurgent Earth. The promised wonders of our species' earliest ambitions were made manifest, and our application and control of the sciences was unparalleled. Humanity reached its pinnacle, raised up by the miracles of technology which it wrought, reshaping uncounted new colony worlds in the vision of distant old Earth. The legends which remain of that lost realm of ancient human empires speak of a galaxy of plenty, filled with opportunity, culture, technological progress, and wonder. In the heights of those times, lost to all but supposition and myth, humanity made itself as unto gods, able to harness the power of the stars and fashion servants from clay and iron and give them counterfeit life to do their bidding. Unfortunately, this era of advancement was not to last, for mankind fell prey to its own sciences. Mankind's golden age failed, wherein the promised wisdom of science and technology did not elevate mankind to the divine, but rather smote it for the consequences of its reckless excesses and ambitions untempered by reason. Martian-Terran wars of terrible destruction ensued, and the beautiful, animate, thinking tools which mankind had created and so coveted were corrupted and turned upon all humanity in what was called the cybernetic revolt. Horrors were perpetrated to possess meager resources all but depleted from the earlier age of prosperity, and greed and hubris saw fearsome, ancient weapons unleashed that risked our species' very annihilation. Such were the terrors of this time that death could cross vast distances of space, coming unexpected and uninvited to consume entire worlds. This was what is now remembered as the Dark Age of technology, and for many Terran millennia it reigned. Mankind's first interstellar empire would fall into bloody ruin, isolation, and ignorance. The terrible period of history that followed is officially named the Age of Strife by imperial historians, although it has another name, whispered only fearfully, Old Night. During the darkness of Old Night, humanity experienced naught but nightmare and predation for over 5,000 standard years. During this time, the worlds of mankind were isolated by searing warp storms that made interstellar travel and communication virtually impossible, and Old Earth was totally cut off from its colonies and allies. Across the galaxy, human worlds, bereft of central authority or protection, and with the web of support and supply that had maintained the threads of civilization cut, fell into anarchy and war. Human civilization was torn apart as local factions and new empires fought for control in the shattered realm, while others, utterly cut off from aid, succumbed to the horrors of planet-wide famine, insanity, and worse, the perils of the warp. The existence of warp entities and the dangers they posed to the human mind were then barely understood. On worlds with large concentrations of emergent human psyches, the entities from beyond were able to breach the barrier between the immaterium and corporeal reality, and it cannot be known or guessed how many worlds were ravaged or swallowed whole by their incursions. As human civilization fragmented, hundreds of xeno-species and enemies unknown seized their chance for revenge on humanity for its past conquests, or to plunder unprotected worlds and enslave their populations. Hundreds more human-inhabited star systems were sacked and ravaged, their peoples slaughtered, mutilated, or abducted. Those that survived the alien onslaught rapidly reverted to barbarism, stripped of civilization, knowledge, and culture in the raw battle to endure. Humanity stood on the brink of total extinction, and endless night gathered round its children. Alone and beset by internal strife, famine, and plague, under incessant attack by aliens, and facing the horrors of warp incursions, the human worlds that survived were pitiable shadows of what they once had been. It was to become an age when mankind's dead far outnumbered its living. Shorn of its galactic empire, ancient terror could not sustain itself. Protracted internecine wars emptied Old Earth's terrible arsenals of radiological weaponry, killing untold billions, destroying its ancient power structures, and boiling off the last of its oceans. In their aftermath, the planet became a lawless battleground, little more than a blasted desert dotted with ruins, its people reduced to the level of brute savages fighting over the scarce water and untainted land which remained. Old Earth expired entirely, all of its ancient knowledge lost and its cities torn down, and where it once stood, instead reigned a world of savagery and horror, the equal of any brought to ruin in the Age of Strife. Long before left powerless and polluted, generations of constant warfare made Terra a wasteland punctuated by fortified holdfasts built amid the wreckage of lost civilizations, and its inhabitants a mass of degenerate feral nomads. Insane prophets, cybernetically augmented butcher kings, vivisector warlords, and religious demagogues led the warring techno-barbarian tribes of Old Earth, and the world was racked by incessant conflict as one tyrant displaced another. Petty empires rose and disintegrated. Techno-barbarian tribes formed, were destroyed and reformed as diminishing, brutalized shadows of lost glories and forgotten triumphs. Uncounted billions died unknown and unremembered, while whispered names such as the Unspeakable King and the Seven Neverborn left legends to terrify generations to come. Anarchy and bloodshed was lord over all. For those few with time enough to spare thought to such matters, it would have seemed as if there were no hope and no help, the end times were at hand, and a slow, bitter descent into destruction was all that any could see as humanity's future. Many succumbed to despair, believing no force imaginable could save mankind and free it from its hellish bondage, but they would be proved wrong. During the turbulent era known as the Age of Strife or Old Night, the Sol system and the nearby star systems that had been colonized by humanity during the Age of Technology were effectively cut off from interstellar travel or communication with each other. This was due to the massive warp storms that swept the galaxy as the Imperium was roiled by the millennia-long gestation of the chaos god Slaanesh and the turbulence that marked the decay of the Eldari Empire before the fall. During this dark time, Terra sometimes held sway over the Sol system, while at other times the rulers of Mars or Luna were dominant. The different worlds found themselves constantly at war. During this 5,000 standard year-long period of anarchy, fear, and violence, Old Earth's once unified planetary government had completely broken down and been divided into dozens of warring states of so-called techno-barbarians. Continuous warfare raged across the surface of Terra for 2,500 standard years, beginning in the late 27th millennium. Little remained of the once sophisticated civilization of Old Earth's glorious past as the center of a growing human interstellar commonwealth marked by advanced science, high culture, and wondrous technologies. Techno-barbarian warlords and their warrior hordes continuously fought over the planet, which had become little more than a massive battleground for their wars of attrition. They made use of chemical, biological, and even thermonuclear weapons of mass destruction, and slowly transformed the cradle of mankind into a battered, post-apocalyptic wasteland across most of its scarred surface. Thunder Warrior Captain. An Imperial Thunder Warriors captain who fought during the Unification Wars of the early 30th millennium. This was a dark period for the people of Old Earth, when they were dominated by brutal rulers and despotic tyrants. It was against this backdrop of oppression, violence, and casual brutality that the Emperor of Mankind first revealed himself openly to the people of Terra. In secret, he had been planning for this moment in history for millennia, ever since the Age of Strife had fractured what remained of the ancient human interstellar civilization. With his massive army of genetically enhanced warriors who comprised the first units of the Imperial Army and would serve as the prototypes for the later development of the Space Marines, the Emperor began his conquest of Terra. His intent was to reunite the warring nations of the world into a unified planetary government, and then use Terra as the springboard from which to begin his reconquest of the galaxy under the aegis of an Imperium of man, dedicated to the atheistic imperial truth of progress and reason. Brutal rulers such as the warlord Caligan of Versh, Cardinal Tang of the Indonesic bloc, and the most infamous of all, the half-mad, half-genius Nathaniel Doom, the tyrant of the Pan-Pacific Empire, would all fall by the wayside. Once unleashed, the genetically enhanced armies of the Emperor swept all before them like wheat before the harvester's scythe until all the techno-barbarian warlords had either been conquered outright or had agreed through diplomacy to become subservient to the Emperor's will. During this time, the Emperor created a number of military organizations, such as the Imperial Army, which would become the nucleus of the armed forces that would later support his Space Marine legions and his reconquest of the human-settled galaxy. Amongst the early Imperial Army units that saw action during the Unification Wars were such venerable regiments as the Geno 5-2 Chiliad, which would become one of the oldest and most respected regiments within the Imperial Army. Like many of these early regiments, the Geno soldiers were created through the use of some of the Emperor's sophisticated genetic engineering techniques, developed in his laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, and by the advanced geneticists who called Luna home. The most elite of this first generation of genetically engineered super soldiers were known as the Thunder Warriors, men who were physically stronger and more formidable in combat than even the later Space Marines, though they were engineered to be vicious killers and lacked many of the more noble aspects of the Astartes, as well as their tremendously long lifespans. The Thunder Warriors were engineered to be the means to an end, and were never intended to be integrated into the Emperor's new realm after unity had been achieved. Through genetic engineering and selection, the standard Geno soldiers displayed many of the characteristics of the perfect human warrior. They were physically more resilient, stronger, and capable of taking more damage than any of their unaltered techno-barbarian foes, including the ability to face down rogue psykers and sorcerers. These early genetically engineered Imperial Army regiments would go on to continue serving the Emperor after the conclusion of the Unification Wars. These regiments would eventually be referred to as the Old Hundred and would form the core of the initial military force that embarked upon the Emperor's galaxy-spanning Great Crusade in the late 30th millennium beside his newly created Space Marine Legions, the early versions of which had taken part in the later campaigns of the Wars of Unification. When the Unification Wars were complete in the late 30th millennium, the Emperor forged a new unified planetary government for Terra under his leadership. He next journeyed to Mars and met with the tech adepts of the cult Mechanicus. In return for the use of the Mechanicum's vast manufactoria, the use of its Titan legions, and the orbital shipyards to construct the weaponry and starships he would need for his Great Crusade to reunite mankind under the banner of the Imperial Truth, the Emperor agreed to grant the Mechanicum complete autonomy on Mars and its other forge worlds, as well as an exemption to the atheism required by the Imperial Truth. This agreement, known as the Treaty of Mars, the Treaty of Olympus to the Mechanicum, marks the true foundation of the Imperium of Man in the alliance between Terra and Mars. Following the successful conclusion of the Unification Wars, the Emperor convened the ruling body known as the War Council to manage the execution of the Great Crusade intended to reunite the entire human-settled galaxy under a single government. The War Council effectively became the true ruling body of the Imperium during the early and middle years of the Great Crusade. The Emperor himself sat at the head of the council. At his left hand was Malkader the Sigillite, perhaps the Emperor's greatest ally during the Wars of Unity, and a human psyker whose powers were matched only by those of the Emperor. The rest of the council was composed of talented administrators drawn from the great ruling aristocratic dynasties of Terra and the Segmentum Solar, and when the Emperor forged his alliance with the Mechanicum of Mars, the Fabricator General of the Mechanicum also claimed his seat. The War Council was also attended by the Paternova of the Navigator houses. As the Emperor departed the homeworld of mankind to lead the Great Crusade into the stars starting around Ca. 798 and 30, he left the legendary Malkader to act as the regent of Terra and the head of the War Council in his stead. At the same time, Malkader took the lead in creating the clades of Imperial assassins that would eventually evolve into the Officio Assassinorum, making Malkader the first Grand Master of Assassins. When the great warp storms that had cut off Terra since the end of the Dark Age of technology subsided, and the Age of Strife came to an end at the dawn of the 31st millennium, the Emperor of Mankind deemed it time to begin his Great Crusade, a massive campaign to conquer the galaxy by which he and his armies would free all human-settled colony worlds from alien oppression or primitive ignorance and reunite the human race across the galaxy under the single banner of the new Imperium of Man. To execute this plan, the Emperor created the Primarchs, his godlike, genetically engineered superhuman offspring. Imperium Dominatus Ancient Map. Ancient Departamento Cartographica Map, labeled Imperium Dominatus, which displays the extent of the Imperial Demand in the last year of the Great Crusade K. 892.005 and 31 before the start of the Great Conflict. The Primarchs were still in their infancy, growing to hyper-accelerated maturity in their special gestation tanks when they were snatched away from the genetic laboratory deep beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, where they had been created and gestated by the Emperor using his own DNA. The cause of this disappearance was the Chaos Gods, who were fearful that with the Primarchs, the Emperor would be able to impose his new order across the galaxy and weaken their own firm grip on the collective unconsciousness of the minds of humanity, which was the source of both their existence and the growth in their power within the Immaterium. Uniting their powers under the leadership of Tzeentch, the Dark Gods opened a portal from the warp and broke into the laboratory where the Primarchs were gestating through the potent psychic wards the Emperor had erected. Unable to destroy the Primarchs outright because of the protections the Emperor had laid upon them, the Chaos Gods instead chose to scatter them across the galaxy through the warp. Imperium Dominatus Ancient Map 3. The Imperium of Man at its greatest extent during the Great Crusade K. 892.005 and 41. This was the stage upon which the heresy would play out. The superhuman infants eventually came to rest on diverse, human-inhabited worlds. It was at this time that the ruinous powers first touched the souls of those Primarchs who would eventually turn to the worship of chaos, infecting them with a shard of corruption. Certainly, the fact that each of the Primarchs was ultimately cast ashore on an inhabited human world was no accident. The Chaos Gods may have hoped that by having the Primarchs raised among humanity without the direct guidance of the Emperor, as they grew they would display more of the human weaknesses that would make them easier to corrupt when the time came. During the course of the Great Crusade, the Emperor encountered each of the Primarchs on their scattered homeworlds in turn. To fill the gap in his military plans for the Great Crusade wrought by the Primarchs' absence after they had been stolen away, the Emperor had instead created 20 Space Marine legions, several of which, such as the Ist Legion, had been raised even as the Unification Wars still raged. The Emperor used the Primarchs' individual genetic material still in his possession to craft the genetically enhanced transhuman warriors of each of the Legion's Astartes, creating 19 gene seed organs that could be implanted within an adolescent human male to transform him into a Space Marine. After the Emperor rediscovered his sons scattered across the galaxy, he deemed it fitting that each Primarch should lead their genetic offspring as the master of the Legion whose Astartes bore their DNA. However, in time this decision would prove a critical mistake, as the Space Marine gene seed creation process made the Emperor, the Primarchs, and the Space Marines analogous to grandfather, fathers and sons, respectively, in their genetic inheritance and superhuman abilities. In time, many of the Space Marines in the Legions, especially those recruited from their Primarch's homeworld rather than from Terra before the Primarch's rediscovery, would come to venerate and feel more loyalty for their Primarch than the Emperor of mankind. The Ullanor Crusade was a vast imperial assault on the Orc Empire of the Overlord Ulek Urek during the late 30th millennium. This massive undertaking would mark the culmination of the Great Crusade's expansion. Ullanor, the capital world of this greenskin empire and the site of the final assault, lay in the Ullanor system of the galaxy's Ullanor sector. The Crusade included the deployment of 100,000 Space Marines, 8 million Imperial Army troops, and thousands of Imperial starships and their support personnel. The Ullanor Crusade marked the high point of the Great Crusade's vast effort to reunite the scattered colony worlds of humanity. The Orcs of Ullanor represented the largest concentration of Orcs ever defeated by the military forces of the Imperium of Man before the Third War for Armageddon began during the 41st millennium. With the great victory sealed in blood and iron, the call to a triumph was sounded to recognize this high point of the Great Crusade and to honor all the warriors of the Ullanor Crusade, mortals and Astartes alike, for their extraordinary valor and service to humanity's cause. By the Emperor's command, Ullanor was remade as a trophy world, designated Mundus Tropaeum on all galactic maps and records of tithe. It would be a sight of glory and spectacle to cement not only this single conquest over the forces ranged against mankind, but a greater symbol of the Great Crusade itself. For 200 Turan years, the Emperor's mighty endeavor had moved across the face of the galaxy to bring unity and illumination to the lost daughter worlds of old Earth. It had pushed back the night, reforged old links between civilizations, battled alien threats, and with regret, it had often punished those who refused to return to the imperial fold. A change was coming though, a change that found its fulcrum on Ullanor. None who walked upon that world knew that the echo of that triumph would sound for solar decades, for standard centuries, for millennia. The glory of this triumphant spectacle has so many of the Imperium's scattered military forces gathered in one place for the first time in centuries was to remain in the mind of every Astartes as the high point of the great endeavor that they were engaged upon. It would prove to be a bright memory to recall in the dark days of the Horus Heresy after Astartes had turned against Astartes and Primarch against Primarch. To prepare the world for the triumph of Ullanor, geoformer platoons from the ancient Mechanicum brought world engines and mobile stone burners to cut a massive swath across the broken landscape left in the battle's wake. Orcish dead were buried by the millions with their savage ruins, interred beneath transplanted rocks and the heads of crushed mountains. The Mechanicus eradicated every last remaining trace of the enemy and paved over them with a giant boulevard, a parade stage as wide as the footprint of some entire imperial cities. They built a highway and allowed only one structure to stand besides the great platform, an ornamental pavilion of black marble and heavy granite that had been built piecemeal on Terra and then shipped across the void by special envoy. Marker posts decorated with the skulls of Orc commanders paced out the length of the road, and behind them great balls of smokeless promethium burned brightly, endlessly lighting the highway with their blue-white fire. When the Mechanicum had finished their work, the Armored came to pay homage to the battle won, the great Crusade's ideal of human unity, and the Emperor who was father to all mankind. The Imperial army and the Titan legions bracketed the gathering. Human troops were ranked in uncountable numbers, their hosts so wide they became a sea of battle armor and dress uniforms. Every common man and woman who stood on Ullanor's soil that day had been selected for their valor and conduct, and until the day they died each would have the singular honor of wearing the onyx and gold Ullanor Triumph Bar upon their uniforms. The award was forged from bolter shells recovered from the field and melted down. Ranged around them, the great war machines of the Collegia Titanica towered towards a sky cut to ribbons by the contrails of 1,000 aerospace fighters, and above those, high over the thin white cirrus clouds of Ullanor's day, Imperial warships moved as slow as they dared through the upper atmosphere, washes of interface heat rolling off their void shields as they showed their flanks in a gesture of renewed fealty. A full 14 of the Space Marine legions stood represented at the triumph of Ullanor, and with them came 9 beings of superhuman power and majesty. 9 gods and angels made flesh, the primarchs of the greatest armies ever created by human hands. Mortarion, the reaper of men and master of the Death Guard, cowled and lethal in aspect, matched by the warrior guardians of his Death Shroud Honor Guard. The Phoenician Fulgrim, resplendent in his finery and handsome in aspect, lit by the reflection of gold and platinum. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the Lord of the Unknown, his soul as much a mystery to the common world as the workings of the warp and the ghosts within it. Lorga Aurelian, the quiet and brooding zealot who burned with such intensity and buried it all deep in his heart, saying little and standing watchful. His polar opposite was Angron, the gladiator lord and son of grief, never able to settle or moderate his seething, endless fury, always on the verge of outburst and violence. Rogaldorn, the stalwart man of stone, the imperial fist with his unswerving manner and unbreakable focus, the one who would always obey, would always be ready for duty. Jagatai Khan, his fur-trimmed robes and ornate armor detailed with 1,000 narratives of the White Scars Legion, his every step across the land a challenge to the galaxy. Then Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, flanked by the gold-armored honor detail of the Sanguinary Guard, his mighty wings folded back across his battle plate, his face turned to the sky to welcome the impossible, majestic sight before him. Then finally came Horus of the Lunar Wolves, the hero of Ullanor, liberator and first among equals. Horus, who was to be given the new honor of an imperial title above and beyond any that had been bestowed before. A title, it could be said, that would forever carry the echo of his name. After declaring Horus as Imperial Warmaster and the new supreme military commander of the Great Crusade, the Emperor, to the shock of those assembled, announced his own intention to return to Terra to pursue a secret project intended to benefit all mankind. After more than 200 standard years of hard conflict, by the early 31st millennium, over 2 million human-settled worlds across the Milky Way galaxy had been reclaimed by the Emperor in the name of the Imperium of Man. Beside him had stood the Primarch Horus, who had fought alongside the Emperor for the early part of the Great Crusade as his only rediscovered gene-son and primary military commander, glorying in the singular attentions of his father. The long wars had forged a strong bond between them. and they were truly father and son. But now the Emperor had to consolidate his newborn Imperium and undertake the next phase of his grand plan. He intended to create a wedway through the Immaterium, much like that used by the Eldari, that would be open to humanity by wielding the psychic augmentation technology of the artifact from the Age of Technology known as the Golden Throne. This work required his continued presence on Terra, and so after Horus' magnificent victory in the Ullanor Crusade against the largest horde of orcs ever encountered in the galaxy at that time, the Emperor departed and left Horus in charge of the Great Crusade with the exclusive title of Warmaster. As Warmaster, Horus was the commanding general of all of the Imperium of Man's military forces, charged with leading the other Primarchs and their legions through the remainder of the Great Crusade. At this announcement there was much shock and outrage. Many of the other Primarchs did not understand why the Emperor was leaving them to fight the enemies of mankind alone, and worse still, why Horus should be raised as the first amongst equals. Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius and Fulgrim were pleased for their brother, the new Warmaster, while others, such as Angren, Robert Gilliman, Lion L. Johnson and Petrobbo, all reacted with varying degrees of disapproval. The situation only grew worse when the Emperor announced that he would be creating a civilian administrative bureaucracy known as the Council of Terra that was comprised of imperial bureaucrats and nobles to carry out the day-to-day governmental affairs of the Imperium, replacing the direct rule of the Emperor while he was engaged in his secret Imperial Wedway project. The Council of Terra would implement and administer the new galaxy-wide tax of resources and manpower called the Imperial Tithe and other matters of day-to-day law in the Imperium of Man, while the Emperor focused on bringing his Wedway project to fruition using the technology of the Golden Throne. The Primarchs would be relegated to a primarily military role as the Imperium's most preeminent commanders. Many of the Primarchs, including Horus, were deeply disturbed that their father would make them subject to normal men and women who had never shed blood in the establishment or expansion of the Imperium, and that he would remove them from the political positions of rule to which they believed they were entitled after their sacrifices. However, the Emperor had sought to create a civilian bureaucracy for the Imperium precisely because he wanted regular human beings to learn to govern themselves once more and not become beholden to a permanent, genetically enhanced ruling class. The Chaos Gods would ultimately use the Primarchs' resentment as one of the all-too-human weaknesses they could exploit to corrupt half their number. After the decisive victory during the Ullanor Crusade, when mankind's reascension to predominance in the galaxy was no longer in doubt, the Emperor bestowed upon the Primarch Horus Lupercal the title of Imperial Warmaster and ceded to him control of all the Imperium's military forces in the Emperor's stead. The other Primarchs were then instructed to follow Horus and obey him and complete the Great Crusade under his direction. There was, it is said, some disquiet among the Primarchs that the Emperor had decided to no longer fight alongside them, but the Emperor at the time was as adamant as he was close-mouthed as to what he would do on his return to Terra. The Emperor then departed for the homeworld of mankind and the dungeons deep beneath his great imperial palace to begin his so-called great work on the creation of a human extension into the labyrinth dimension of the Wedway under a veil of secrecy previously unknown in the Imperium. He drew to him certain advisors and agents of the Mechanicum and retired to the private vaults deep beneath his city fortress within the Imperial Palace known as the Imperial Dungeons. Upon his return to Terra, the Emperor called to his side Malkader and the Fabricator General Kalbahal of the Martian Mechanicum. He issued them with new commands. No longer were they to support the military campaigns, as these were now safely in the hands of his sons the Primarchs and the newly appointed Warmaster Horus. The Emperor needed time and all of his focus to be directed at his next great project, which would tie the newborn Imperium together and unite it as no other human polity had ever been united. To this end, the Emperor convened the First Council of Terra. Unlike the War Council, of which Horus was now the leader, the Council of Terra would attend to matters of state and the establishment and maintenance of imperial law across the myriad worlds of the Imperium. In particular, the Council of Terra was to administrate the establishment of the imperial tithe of troops and resources from all the worlds of the Imperium that were required to support the Great Crusade. In effect, to the new Council of Terra would fall the entirety of the civil government of the Imperium. Malcador, the Emperor's most trusted advisor, was named as the First Lord of the Council and Regent of Terra, and he would lead it in the Emperor's absence. The Fabricator General of the Mechanicum of Mars, Kelbohel, Captain General Constantin Valdor of the Legio Custodes, and the Masters of the Adeptus Astronomica, the Adeptus Astrotelepathica, and the Administratum of the Imperium were also appointed to the Council of Terra. Having established the new governing body of the Imperium to carry out the day-to-day work of ruling tens of thousands of worlds and trillions of human beings, the Emperor took refuge in his vast laboratories and workshops beneath the Imperial Palace. He began work in earnest on his new project. While the Emperor was locked away in his subterranean factories, trouble was brewing. The formation of the Council of Terra proved to be a contentious decision with the distant Primarchs, who were appalled when news of the formation of the Council finally reached them on the frontiers of the Great Crusade. Some of the Primarchs took great exception to being ruled by those they deemed less worthy of such an honor than themselves. The less stable Primarchs felt that this was a betrayal of all they had fought and won in the Emperor's name, and that their victories now counted for nothing. The Primarchs, and many of their Astartes, felt that it was they who had suffered and sacrificed the most to build the Imperium, and thus it was they who should have the greatest say in how it was ruled, not a council composed of effete Terran nobles and faceless bureaucrats. This was one of many growing resentments that allowed the ruinous powers to infect and corrupt several of the Primarchs. The creation of the Council of Terra, seen in this light, lent new weight to Horus' later argument to several of his brothers that the Imperium had been betrayed by their father. He argued that the Emperor had proved more than willing to turn his back on his sons and generals and give power instead to petty mortal administrators and the sycophantic tech adepts of Mars who lacked the Primarch's brilliance and superhuman abilities. As Horus prepared his rebellion against the Emperor, he convinced himself that petty functionaries and administrators had supplanted the Primarchs and the Astartes within the Imperium they had won. Once the Imperium had been wholly geared for the war and conquest that was its life's blood since its inception, but now Horus believed that it had become burdened with parasitic executors, scribes, and scriveners who demanded to know the cost of everything. Bureaucracy was taking over. Red tape, administrators and clerks were replacing the heroes of the age. Horus argued to his more receptive brothers that unless the Imperium changed its ways and direction, its greatness as an empire would soon be a footnote in history books. Horus feared that everything he and his brother Primarchs had achieved would be a distant memory of former glory, lost in the mists of time like the civilizations of ancient Terra. It was this hubris and arrogance that led to the War Master's inevitable fall to chaos and the resultant civil war that would consume the entire galaxy, ushering in a new age of darkness that would last for millennia. Yet Horus and his more resentful brothers had completely misunderstood the Emperor's intent in creating the Council of Terra. The Council was to become the body of civilian government that would administrate the myriad bureaucratic tasks needed for the survival of the newly formed human interstellar empire. The Emperor was determined that in his Imperium power would reside with those mortal men and women who were governed by its apparatus, and not with an artificial military elite composed of genetically engineered beings who were so powerful that they already possessed only a very tenuous grip upon their own humanity. The Primarchs and their space marines had been created to give life to the Emperor's dream of a united human Imperium stretching across the galaxy and to defend it from humanity's myriad foes. They were never intended to rule it as a hereditary caste of immortal warriors imposing their whims upon those they deemed mere mortals by brute force. The Primarchs and the Space Marines had been created to protect mankind, not become new tyrants over it.